It's been a year since Sudan's latest grim conflict started. Thousands have died, millions displaced and facing food shortages. Why isn't more being done to help those suffering 12 months on? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, EU countries have pledged over $950 million to ease the humanitarian suffering in Sudan. That brings the total to less than half what the UN actually needs. But unless the fighting stops, this crisis will only deepen.
April 15th last year, explosions in Khartoum, the beginning of violence that still has no end in sight. Two warring factions want control of the country. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the Sudanese armed forces, against the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti. This comes after former President Omar al-Bashir was toppled in 2019 after nearly 3 decades in power, with another coup in 2021 toppling the fledgling civilian government. Caught in the middle, millions of civilians have been forced to flee their homes.
It was very, very difficult. For a long period, we were hiding under our beds. No food, no water, no help. The bombs came from all sides.
Today, Sudan is one of the world's worst humanitarian tragedies. Half of Sudan's population, 25 million people, need humanitarian assistance. More people have fled conflict in the past year in Sudan than anywhere else in the world, with 8.6 million people forced to flee their homes, including 4 million children.
Over 6.5 million people have been internally displaced within Sudan, while nearly 1.8 million have fled to makeshift camps outside the country. For those living in the camps, the danger isn't over. They're facing disease and hunger as facilities have become overwhelmed. Aid organizations need at least another $2 billion that doesn't appear to be forthcoming. So what next for millions of Sudanese who need help and stability?
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Nairobi in Kenya is Assadullah Nasrullah. He is Communications Officer for the UN High Commission for Refugees in Sudan. Elbashir Idris is the coordinator of the Sudanese Diaspora Network and a human rights activist. He joins us from Cardiff in Wales. And here with me in the studio, I'm delighted to say, is Alex Vines. He is Director of the Africa Programme at Chatham House, which is a think tank. And Yassmin Abdel-Magied, she's a Sudanese author and activist. Yassmin, I'll come to you first. I saw a quote this week from Will Carter, who's Sudan Director for the Norwegian Refugee Council. He described this year milestone as a milestone of shame. He's right, isn't he?
Yes, unfortunately, I think he is. It's a tragic situation. I think so many of us were dreading this 1-year anniversary, as it were, hoping that we wouldn't reach the point where we would have to say it's 365 days of this conflict between a number of belligerents that has meant the majority of Sudanese people are either displaced or in need of humanitarian support. And it's unfortunately, although some are calling it a forgotten war, it's an ignored war. It's a conflict that I think many would say, who are interested in the region, would say that people are ignoring, that governments are ignoring, and we're hoping that will change. But it has meant that there is massive suffering.
And Alex, all this suffering is going on, but the media spotlight just isn't there. I mean, there was a lot of attention at the outset when foreign governments and Western countries wanted to get their citizens and passport holders out. But the last few months, there's been virtually no coverage.
Well, it's been the international media coverage has been inconsistent. So you're absolutely right. At the beginning of the conflict, plenty of coverage. And then in the run-up to this miserable anniversary of conflict, there has been, over the last month or so, more attention, more journalists going in through Port Sudan. But it is about the lack of consistency. This will once again be ignored. The world media finds it very difficult to focus on multiple crises. So Gaza, Ukraine makes Sudan go down the pecking list, I think. It becomes deprioritized in terms of media resources and attention.
Assadullah, just spell out for us how dire the situation is now in Sudan for millions and millions of people?
Well, it's quite dire. It's I would say devastating. 1 year on, and the war in Sudan continues. It's even further escalated and geographically expanded, and thousands of civilians are still fleeing on daily basis because of the conflicts.
Elbashir, we read this week that famine is now looming large for millions of people.
Well, as MSF said yesterday in the Paris conference, or in the International Donor Paris conference, trucks of food have been waiting at least 6 months before even entering Khartoum. And the famine that we're seeing, a level 5 famine by the IPC, that hinders Darfur, Al Jazeera, and the whole country, especially a country that's been considered the breadbasket of the Middle East, now having to import grains and food from Ukraine, and they're going through a war as well. So it just shows the dire situation of just how much the Sudanese people really need to get those supplies in from anywhere around the world. However, there are a lot of complications and mechanisms that hinder that. Aid, unfortunately, does become politicized, and we're seeing that in this war.
Islamic Relief are on the ground in Port Sudan. Jacob Opwapo is their business development manager. This is what he had to say this week. He's calling for the international community to bring both sides round a negotiating table.
Our appeal to the international community is to put more exerted efforts to bring the warring parties into the negotiation table so that the negotiations can take place, this war can end, and we can have the Sudanese, both displaced internally and externally, to be able to return home and to rebuild their country, rebuild their lives.
Yassmin, he's got a very valid point, hasn't he? The longer this goes on, the more suffering for millions and millions of people. What are the prospects of these two generals sitting down together and sorting this out?
The question of the prospect, I think, is separate to the question of the necessity. Like, unfortunately, the humanitarian situation, which is, as we've discussed, catastrophic and one of the worst in the world at this current moment, cannot be improved and cannot be dealt with unless there is a cessation of war, unless we find ways for humanitarian aid to come through. And that really does require the belligerents to be sitting at the table. Now, there are different views on this. There is this kind of a feeling that why should we be having a conversation with people that are responsible for this very conflict? And that is a very understandable and reasonable critique. But unfortunately, we have to incentivize the belligerents to sit at the table. Otherwise, the conflict won't stop and we won't be able to provide the humanitarian aid required. And so when we're thinking about priorities, it is how do we stop the flow of weapons and resources to both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces? Because right now the fire is being fueled from externally or from external interests. And then how do we ensure that there are humanitarian corridors, that we're able to get aid in? Because as Elbashir spoke to, there is aid at various places, but not being able to get through. And then we can think about what does the next phase look like. But until there is a conversation being had, until the weapons are put down, I think that's going to be very difficult.
Alex, who in the international community can reach out and make an impact here and perhaps have these generals even listen to them?
Yeah, I mean, getting the generals to listen to somebody is really important. At the moment, both belligerents believe that they can have a outright military victory. That's the unfortunate reality we're in at the moment. And so probably the countries with the most influence and on opposing sides are the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. So they're really key to this. But then it's about who are the people that have influence over UAE and also Egypt, and they're United States and others, including, in fact, Turkey can play a role too. And so I think that's where we need to see the real effort now is sustained, consistent pressure, unrelenting pressure on UAE and Egypt to tell the sides that they're supporting, you need to reach a humanitarian ceasefire to allow that humanitarian access in. As you've heard, the famine potential in Sudan is alarming. Already at the donors conference on Monday, they were talking about 5 million Sudanese already in famine and another 25 million Sudanese extremely vulnerable. So there's not time to waste.
Yeah, just looking at those figures, the information we have, nearly a third of the population is acutely food insecure. This is according to UN data. Some 19 million children are out of school. An estimated 3 million Sudanese children are malnourished. And I saw the other day the finance minister of Sudan saying that the country has lost 80% of its income. Assadullah, talk to us about the challenges of getting aid in there and helping the people, because this is going to be a mammoth operation.
Well, it's as your guest mentioned, as the conflict continue, the situation, deteriorate. More and more people become displaced, and more people are becoming dependent on humanitarian assistance. As humanitarian agencies, we as UNHCR, we are on the ground. We're working together with our partners, doing what we can within our available resources. But despite that, and due to the security situation in fighting, we as humanitarian agencies are also facing challenges on the ground with accessibility, with logistical issues, moving supply inside the country. And also there are unnecessary bureaucratic impediments that also impact the timely delivery of the assistance to the people in need. So we call on the parties involved in this conflict to respect international humanitarian law and to allow access to humanitarian agencies and facilitate uninterrupted movement of supplies, so that we can reach to those in need and also to the areas that are impacted by the conflict.
Elbashir, we see so much international attention on Ukraine, on Gaza. Sudan has been pretty much forgotten about now, hasn't it? Let's be honest.
I have to really echo the words of Yassmin here, of it being an ignored war. And the reasons for that, due to many complications. However, those who do, handle the media are not doing a good enough job in putting the voices of the Sudanese out there in the world. The Sudanese people, the only thing they ever wanted really was the army to return to its barracks, for the militias to be disbanded, and for the Sudanese people to have a civilian government and a democratic government. However, because there's more focus, as it should be, on the war and the belligerents, at the same time, a lot of the voices of those who are actually impacted by this war are not being heard, and it's also not being helped by internet blackouts. So though others may say it's a forgotten war, it's certainly being ignored by those who know better.
Well, there was a conference in Paris on Monday. Afterwards, the German foreign minister did speak about the millions and millions of euros that will be going to Sudan. Let's just take a listen to what she said.
The people there lack practically everything. They need food, nutrition, clean drinking water, baby food, medication, clothing, schools, emergency shelter, and above all, psychological care. Germany will therefore provide a further €2,440 million in humanitarian aid today to provide these people with the essential they need to survive.
Yassmin, this money was needed a year ago. I mean, why is it taking so long for Europe to get its act together here?
Why it's taken so long, I don't know the answer. I mean, and it is a frustration. I think there's a couple of different things that come to mind as we hear. It is a positive story that at least some money has been pledged, right? And especially when, just days ago, we were saying to people, only 6% of the pledge has been, of the ask has been pledged. Now, at least there is some more money being said. However, there's a couple of different sort of caveats. One, it's a question of how much new money is there. And two, it's a question of where exactly is the money going. And three, how do we ensure that because, you know, we've been talking about the humanitarian crisis. One thing that I think perhaps is missing from this conversation is the slight positive story of things like the emergency response rooms, the grassroots people in Sudan that have actively been doing the work of humanitarian organizations who haven't been able to get into the country, literally feeding tens of thousands of people in their own community. It would make sense for some of the money that is being pledged to go to them because they are already on the ground. But you know, we know that big humanitarian agencies move slowly. We know that it might be difficult to get money to those groups. So something that I'm wondering is, how do we ensure that the money that is being pledged will actually get to the people on the ground and not dissipate, you know, as it crosses the border?
And a ceasefire has to happen before anyone can go in. Is that what we're looking at?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I think also we have to consider that the interests, yes, there is a humanitarian interest, but there is also the EU, for example, has given money in the past that is more about reducing the number of migrants coming to its borders and so on. And so there are there can sometimes be caveats and strings to this money that it's not yet clear whether or not those kinds of strings will be attached.
Alex, what's your reading of the military situation, the two generals? So they took power together in a coup a few years ago, then they fell out. As an outsider looking in, how can the army not just crush a militia? I mean, this militia seems to have, the RSF has grown in strength and seems to be a formidable opponent.
Well, this is a legacy of the Elbashir administration and the way that security was managed. And so you have a militia that in parts of the country is strong as the army. And so crushing it is not straightforward. And what we see at the moment is a danger of partition, in fact, of Sudan into areas controlled by the army and areas that are controlled by the rapid support forces. The humanitarian reality is awful everywhere. So it doesn't really depend on whether you're in an RSF dominated area or one by the Sudan army. I mean, my prime concern, including going back to the point about the pledging that's just happened for humanitarian assistance, is that with the spectre of famine being as visible as it is now, there's not time to waste. So this is really important now to put pressure on those who are supporting the generals to say, you've got to reach a humanitarian ceasefire so that you can get humanitarian assistance into the many millions of Sudanese that desperately need that support right now.
And Assadullah, the sad fact is that Sudan, even before this conflict began a year ago, was one of the poorest places on earth.
Well, yes, that's true. And in addition to that, I can say that before the conflict, Sudan was hosting 1.10 million refugees. It still hosts, almost 960,000 refugees. So the needs are quite massive, not only for the Sudanese displaced people that we've been talking about, but also for the refugees. And despite the urgency of the crisis and the growing humanitarian needs, I have to say that the funding remain critically low. Yes, I hope that the Paris conference and other events and conferences like that will bring more funding and support to the Sudan situation. But overall, I have to say that Sudan is one of the most underfunded humanitarian operation globally. We are grateful for the generosity of the donor countries, but we call on the world to stand with Sudan during this critical time.
Elbashir, what's the feeling like in the diaspora, Sudanese community around the world following this, when they can get news? How are people feeling 1 year on?
Well, it's been a real sense of grief that a lot of the Sudanese and even non-Sudanese who were in Sudan, who had great memories of the country, a lot of grief amongst the communities and global communities. However, there is also a sense of a renewing hope. After 1 year of this war, we've seen the senseless brinkmanship that these generals have taken it to. We've seen how it's been targeting civilians much more than the belligerents themselves. We've seen how it's possible through grassroots community action and coordination that we can make ends meet. Earlier, you said the point of Sudan being one of the poorest countries in the world. Yes, they may be poor in mechanization. However, when it comes to grassroots organizing and being able to support one another, let's not forget this country has been on the state-sponsored terrorist list for basically the past 3 decades. It has developed a way of being able to overcome obstacles, even from the international financial markets down to the situation we're seeing on the ground. And so what we understand, I say we as myself and those I've spoken to around the world, that we need to reorganize and redouble and bolster and galvanize our efforts even more. So there is a way and belief of looking forward to not only ending this war, but alleviating the suffering of the Sudanese people.
Yassmin, wherever there's misery, human traffickers go, criminal gangs. Europe should be paying far more attention to this, shouldn't they? Because what will happen is that people who are being displaced, those who have money, will be targeted by these traffickers. I've seen reports of TikTok and various different social media being used to entice people from Sudan to go and give cash to these gangs.
As you meant, like whenever there is chaos and whenever there is this kind of level of disruption, all sorts of bad actors come into play. And that plays out in lots of different ways. Like, for example, there were reports of foreign fighters, so fighters from around the region joining the RSF, for example, because they can get paid. Young people, young men especially, being coerced into fighting for the RSF, for the militia, because that's how they can get a paycheck, or sort of being exploited in other ways. We also know that a lot of people are trying to leave and trying to find whatever ways they can escape. And so again, not to sort of frame it in this way, but when we saw massive migration from Syria about a decade ago, we saw the EU have to install all sorts of really draconian border measures. And those border measures have only become more draconian. And these are the sorts of things that young Sudanese people are facing when they try to leave. And then you create a whole economy, a black market economy around movement and migration and so forth. So, I mean, you cannot expect this level of disruption in this bigger country without expecting that there will be, for this long, without expecting there to be kind of overflows across the border and so on. And yes, the focus is on Gaza, and yes, the focus is on Ukraine at the moment, but this is also going to become a generational problem. This is not, people are not going to go back to school straight away. The level of damage to the infrastructure means that you then have to consider, once the war stops and once the humanitarian crisis is addressed, how do you rebuild the infrastructure for a society such that you don't lose a generation of people?
Alex, just looking forward, I mean, do you think we'll be back here in a year's time talking about a 2-year anniversary of this war?
Unfortunately, I worry about that, because the longer this war continues, the greater the risk that it will become fully ethnicized. I mean, we haven't had time to discuss Darfur and some of the horrible things that are going on in different regions of Sudan. It's obviously going to become engulfed in famine if the humanitarian response doesn't kick in now. And that will make a negotiated settlement even more difficult. So again, there is real urgency to focus on Sudan right now and reach a humanitarian agreement initially, and then try and find out what is the area of common ground between a dispute between two generals, because that's what's fundamentally here. This is a power struggle between two individuals. There has to be a way to work out a pathway to reach an accommodation to end this in Sudan and return to a more peaceful situation.
And you genuinely feel the country could split along those lines, the areas that are held by the army and the RSF? Well,
and the danger is that you've got neighboring countries like Egypt, as I've mentioned, the United Arab Emirates. Iran has been involved. It's provided drones, for example. It could suddenly see this as another area for proxy operations, splitting the country apart. That's a very dangerous scenario, which again is why it's urgent to reach accommodation sooner rather than later, because the longer this takes, the more opportunity there is for others to be mischievous about the future of Sudan.
And does that worry you, Yassmin?
Well, yeah, I want to sort of underscored the real risk that Alex is speaking about. Because we know with the Sudanese armed forces, for example, there are groups, armed groups like the Sudanese Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement, so Darfuri communities, which are like very reasonably so furious about what has been happening in Darfur and the fact that it's, there is ethnic cleansing essentially. And they have pledged support for the Sudanese armed forces. And it is possible, for example, the Sudanese armed forces decide that they will focus on getting Khartoum back, getting Medani, a few key areas, and then just sort of leaving the same attitude they've had for the last 30 years, leaving the rest of the country to its own devices and leaving that to be controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. And so you do then have, and the head of the Rapid Support Forces, Hemeti, has enough of his own personal wealth, has enough gold mines and so on, that arguably that is a possibility. That's a terrible possibility, one we don't want to see, but it is something that if there isn't an intervention, that is possible.
Yassmin, Alex, thank you both. And to our guests online, Assadullah and Elbashir, thank you for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here on Roundtable, thank you for watching.